This is Mark Turin on the 2nd of September 2004 in Ithaca, New York, and it gives me great pleasure, it's a great honor for me also, to sit here with Professor Terence Turner, Professor of Anthropology at Cornell University, recently retired, and to sit here with Terry asking a few questions about life, research, studies, students. Perhaps, Terence, we could start off with some basic biodata. Where were you born and to whom?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia, though I was born, on the last day of 1935, and I remained in Philadelphia somewhat less time than I had been inside my mother. I think we moved about 4 months later to Wilmington, Delaware, and then to Frederick, Maryland. My father, this was the Depression, of course. My father had just gone to work for the Maryland State Board of make work, I don't know. It's what became, at the federal level, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which he then went to work for. He was very much a Roosevelt New Deal man, and he went on to work then in the federal government in Washington on all the programs that the Republicans have just dismantled, you know, aid to dependent children, aid to the industrially handicapped, et cetera, et cetera. And he stayed in Washington until, on that kind of job, until the Republicans were elected in 1952, whereupon he went into foreign aid, as it was then called, in which he worked until he finally retired. But that meant that I grew up essentially in a kind of liberal public service kind of atmosphere. My parents' closest friends were social workers and government bureaucrats. My mother had been the librarian of the Pennsylvania School of Social Work where my father took a degree. And so my mother, and she was also the principal of a school. She had actually taught and became principal of the American Community School in Beirut, Lebanon, as part of the Mennonite Relief Fund after World War I. This will tell you that my mother came from a big Mennonite family and colony in the Midwest in Goshen, Indiana. My father came from a Presbyterian, his father was a Presbyterian minister. And so they were basically middle Americans, you might say, but of progressive persuasion. My mother was a published poet and quite an erudite person, and someone who continually either taught or administered educational or outreach programs all her life.
Did she publish under her maiden name or under Turner?
Violet Bender, her maiden name.
Mm-hmm. And you were one of how many children?
3, oldest. I'm the oldest. My brother, 2.5 years older, who, well, he is an investigative journalist, and my sister, 2.5 years younger than that, is an administrative law judge, also now living in Philadelphia, so returned to the roots, as it were, although she actually was born in Frederick, Maryland. So we came from middle Atlantic sort of stock.
What can you tell me more about your parents' respective ancestries? And were grandparents or great-grandparents or uncles and aunts a significant part of your growing up?
Yes, they were. Well, my mother's mother, my grandfather died before, on that side, died before I was born. But my mother's mother was very much part of our early life, and we did go out several summers to Goshen, Indiana, and spend time out with her relatives. My father came from quite a large family, just like my mother. On both sides, my father had 5 sisters. He was the only male. And my sister had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And all of them had families, so that I have lots of cousins. And, they were, you don't want to know about all their professions and so on, but it was, I grew up as part of an extended family.
Was your family quite international? You mentioned the Beirut connection already after World War I, but...
Mennonites are very international. I mean, my mother's eldest brother who was very influential in the whole family. He was the first Mennonite from America to hold an advanced theological degree from Tübingen in Germany. And he had become involved in contacting Mennonite colonies before World War II. There are many German-speaking Mennonites in Russia and Ukraine, and also Mennonite and Hutterite colonies up in Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan. The Mennonite colony from which my mother's family came had started out in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, then went up by covered wagons to Ontario, Kitchener, Ontario, and then back down to Indiana. But they maintained contact with Mennonite colonies all over the world. And my maternal uncle, Wilbur Bender, the one I'm talking about actually is Harold Bender, went around the German-speaking countries of Europe to antiquarian bookstores, searching for and finding many Renaissance period Anabaptist documents, including lots of Bibles, community Bibles, where the records of genealogical records of births and deaths were kept. And of course the communities that these Bibles had been part of and served had all been wiped out, massacred, or forced to, ethnically cleansed by the Catholic reaction after the Counter-Reformation. In my mother's family, the ascending generations, some of whom were still alive, I got to know as a child, always used the term "the war" to refer to the persecutions of Maria Theresa of Austria, who is also, I think, the model of the Queen of the Night in the Magic Flute. It's an international review of sorts.
Absolutely. Did this or anything else lead to early travel in other countries with your parents? Was that a luxury that your family could afford at that time?
No, we traveled a good deal in the United States. My father's idea of broadening travel, and it was a good one, was to take us around, for example, the great New Deal projects like the TVA in Venezuela, in Tennessee, and national parks in the Southwest, Grand Canyon, and so on.
Was it quite a political upbringing in that sense, that you were being confronted with parents' friends who were, you say, social workers or involved in administration, bureaucracy, and working towards building a better country? When I listen to music of that era, it's always much more politicized than the music is of these days.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was political and romantically nationalist. It was how a person could be a Republican was something I grew up without being able to understand.
What was your schooling like? What kinds of schools did you go to? And
public schools. Well, until the end of my second to last year of high school, which was a Maryland public school. But then I got a scholarship to a British school. This was a scholarship offered by a fund that had been established by British parents whose children had been sponsored by Canadian and American families in the early years of the bombing in World War II, when many children were evacuated to North America. And then when the V2 bombs came in, and it was very dangerous again live in London, more children were evacuated. And so the parents of these children put up a trust fund called the Kinsman Trust, which brought Americans, preferably children of the families who had sponsored their children, over to Britain to some educational establishment, everything from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art to so-called public schools, British-style public schools. And I just applied for this when eventually they decided to spend down their capital because there weren't really any more children of those parents. Everybody was too old, you know. So they established an open competition in American public schools, and I happened to get one of those things, and so I ended up finding myself in a British public school, but a very odd one, because it was co-educational, an offspring of a school founded in the Lake District by the son of Arnold Rugby, you know, the famous rugby school.
What was the name of your school?
St. George's in Harpenden, Hertfordshire. So I learned to play rugby and write in a certain way and talk, I guess.
It must have been very competitive, and I'm sure it was a prestigious thing to get the scholarship to go to the UK for 1 or 2 years?
Well, it was potentially 2, but I did go for 1 because I then got in. I got into Harvard, which I applied for from the American Embassy in London. I could have stayed in my British school long enough to pass advanced level school leaving certificate, A levels. But I had been put in what was called 6B. You don't know what 6B. That's the lower sixth form.
Yes.
Where all the people in the lower sixth had already taken O levels, ordinary leaving certificate. So I didn't take that. If I had gone on to university in Britain, which I had never had any intention of doing, I would have had to stay, of course, to take A levels.
Sure.
But instead, I got into Harvard, and I decided I would just go on to college in America at Harvard. I thought that I would be able to transfer my credits from Britain to my American high school and thus get a high school diploma, some kind of certificate. But the Maryland State Board of Education refused because I had not taken the required course in American history, which was not offered in this British public school, and so I was put down and still am in the Maryland statistics as a high school dropout.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
A little more on the British experience, if there are stories to tell. Were your family quite Anglophilic? Was it a good thing that you were going to England, or this is, I suppose, early middle 50s now we're talking?
Well, actually, yes, 1952, 53. Anglophilic, no, but they were both. They had both done English literature, and they were. They'd been very good students. They went to Oberlin College. That's where they first met each other, and they could quote vast stanzas or stretches of, especially the Romantics. You know, Shelley, Wordsworth, Byron, etc., etc., etc. Also Shakespeare. So to that extent, they had sort of. Well, they also knew a lot about American poets and literature too. But beyond that, they weren't particularly English-oriented. I think they had some good British friends whose political orientations were similar. There were socialists, one kind or another, either Labour Party people or someone to the left of that. But otherwise, they were not. They had no aspirations or what do you call it? I don't know, Anglophilic orientations to British class structure. They were very anti-imperial and so on.
Do you have fond memories of your time in the school in St. George's? And how was it different at the time to what you experienced in American public school?
Oh, it was extremely different. I really hated American high school and junior high school for a variety of reasons. It was a time when American culture was sort of at a nadir of kind of conformist, I thought, kind of really banal I don't know, popular culture, and there was McCarthyism. It started up, and well, what else? I mean, how to explain it? I just didn't. I really hated the culture of the thing, and I thought that the attempt to create a democratic, quote, post-quote, culture in American schools by having elections based on popularity and nonsense like that. It was basically disgusting, and I felt really alienated. And to go to Britain, to a public school in Britain, well, it was, needless to say, extremely different. I mean, there was basically with a lot of rather snobby class, upwardly mobile. This was not the creme de la creme of British public schools, but it was a school for people whose parents sent them there to acquire the trappings of class if they didn't already have them. And so there was that kind of social ethos, which I thought, well, I found was quite alien. But nevertheless, it went along with a kind of intellectual culture and certain kinds of, what shall I say, dialogical skills and so on, that one was expected to learn, and there were quite clear-cut rules. And athletics was the same way. I mean, I rather enjoyed rugger, especially, and how to say it. One knew what the rules were, and one was expected, perhaps, to try to get away with breaking them, but to take responsibility if one was caught. I mean, there was none of there was. The result was, I thought, a much more highly individuated sort of character that was developed. I liked the product in many ways, even though I sort of disliked, even despised in some ways, the politics that it came from. So it was I thought, intellectually, the exposure to kind of close reading. This was our teacher was a Leavisite from Cambridge, who was steeped in that level of, at that period, of close reading, close criticism, sort of the equivalent of American new criticism, but with a much heavier emphasis on morality and ethics and so on of text. And it was all, I thought, it was a very intensive, I thought for me, extraordinarily stimulating experience.
Do you retain friendships from that era in the UK?
Only very vaguely. I went back the last time I was in Cambridge, England, as a visitor in the department. I went back and visited a couple of old school friends, which was pleasant. But I don't really keep up from that time in England. My English friends come from later periods.
Finally, if I may ask you about the school and then move on. You were maybe the single or maybe one of a handful of Americans in the school. I don't know. But
there was one other.
Were you well received, and were there prejudices for or against you at that time in England?
Well, there was a great deal of competitiveness between England and America. I mean, England was still a world military power, and there was a lot of, and after all, it was only, 7 years after World War II. A lot of London was still bombed flat, and lots of English cities were still in ruins, and people remembered the war very vividly. There was still rationing, for example, and sort of lousy food and poor heating and so on was a point of national pride, of course. And I was rather big for my age, for my British cohort, and somehow this all coincided with my exposure to first exposure to rugby and things like that. And so there was a good deal of roughhousing, which a lot of it was put on the footing of, well, who was better, the British Navy or the American Navy, or the British Air Force, the American Air Force. I had very definite opinions on that subject, but even if I hadn't, I was expected to produce a certain answer to these challenges, and which led to a good deal of scuffling, but it was all in good fun.
So thereafter, a scholarship to Harvard or admission to the college?
Both.
Great. And with already a direction to study something, or how did you enter, and with what aspirations?
Well, I didn't have much direction. I was, in some ways, I mean, socially, I was really rather poorly prepared for the social universe of Harvard. I mean, the whole prep school culture of America was very different from high school culture. Although about 50% of Harvard by that time was drawn from high schools. And on the other hand, I mean, I had 1 year in this British public school. That didn't make me a public school boy in a British sense either. So I was not, well, then as now, Harvard had rather uneven standards of teaching, education. I don't think that it's a particularly good school for teaching. And, well, I learned a lot. I liked it, but I guess my main personal orientation was political. I mean, I became president of the Harvard Liberal Union, which under my presidency declined from a membership of official membership of somewhere, I guess 50 or 60 to something like 5 or 6. I mean, this was when the liberal aspect of Democratic Party politics and so on was in a really steep national decline. And
what year did you start Harvard?
It was September of 1952. I was the class of 1957. So it was really the most dismal period of post-war American politics. So my main activities as a student, besides classes, were politics, liberal politics as they were then called, and also rugby and a few other sports. But I put a lot into rugby. I became a captain of the Harvard team and so on.
Were the classes stimulating? Did you have some professors who...
Some were. A lot were dull as nails, and even, I thought, really badly taught. But
any particular highlights or professors whose classes you remember? And
well, oddly enough, some of the ones that I remember best were not among the best taught, but it's just the subject matter I was so interested in. I liked some of the history of science classes. I ended up majoring in history. I also did a lot of literature in the sort of new critical vein, analysis of text, literary critical stuff. There was a discipline about that kind of the reading of text. People still believe that there was such a thing as literature and text and so on, and that one should really acquire a certain set of analytical skills and how to write the ability to write critical essays about text and so on. And I think that that training in literary analysis by the standards of that time, even though I thought that there was something really desperately wrong with new criticism, because it was based on abstracting criticism from any connection with social context, social analysis, and so on, and that was obviously dumb, or it was wrong. I was, at that point, I was still, well, I had what became part of my anthropological perspective, I guess. I thought you have to analyze things in a historical and social context to fully understand their meaning, and this was, of course, just the opposite of the new critical approach.
Was it at Harvard that you had your first interface with anthropology, or was that before?
No, I had been interested as a kid in, well, mostly in archaeology, ancient history, and things like that. But I didn't go in for studying those things in college because I thought that they were, in a sense, guilty pleasures. I mean, they were socially and politically irrelevant, and that was a kind of antiquarian indulgence. So I did modern history, modern European mostly, but also American, 19th and 20th century.
Was the war, as in the Second World War, not as in... was that a major part of understanding where the world was going? Was it taught as a contemporary issue, or was it taught as a historical issue already?
Well, let's see, how was World War II? I didn't actually take any courses that focused on the history of World War II, though it came in various ways, in various courses, in formation of modern modern politics or histories of various countries, including U.S. of A. It certainly came in. I had read a lot of military history. I still do. For me, it's a fascinating subject, and it certainly was part of my own ideas about the formation of current contemporary politics, and it still does.
Did you take any anthropology classes at Harvard? Or
I started to take one, and it was so awful that I quit the class after about 4 weeks.
Who was it taught by?
Clyde Kluckman, who was very famous, and he spent the first lecture or two making embarrassing apologies for the terrible ratings that the course had received in the student guide to Harvard courses, where he was panned as a dreadful lecturer, and he was a dreadful lecturer. And I thought it was embarrassing for the man to be doing a terrible job of lecturing about how terrible a lecturer he was. So I walked out. I thought I'd never take another anthropology course. Well, that lasted until graduate school. I found myself going into anthropology.
You graduated, you say, in '57 from Harvard. Was there a clear sense of what you would do next? Was there pressure from your parents to go and get a real job and enter the workforce?
No pressure, no clarity, no ideas really about what the hell I was going to do, except go into the Army, because I had gotten student deferments. I was still in a generation of American men, obviously, at the time, who, if you got 2S student deferments, you were supposedly going to be liable for the draft until the age of 36, whether or not you were married or in a profession or something. And so the smart thing to do was, one way or another, get your military service over before you started having a life. So there had been universal military service up to just about the time I graduated, and there was then a program where one could opt for active training for 6 months and then be in the active reserve for 5.5 years, which involved going for weekly meetings and summer camps and so on. So I thought that seemed like the least troublesome. So I went in as an enlisted man for 6 months, and I did, basic and advanced training in artillery. I became an expert in firing an utterly non-functional but highly technologically advanced anti-aircraft gun, which never worked. And eventually I think it was all sent down to the Venezuelan army without ever seeing action.
So that was immediately after Harvard, after graduating, 6 months. Where were you based in your 6 month training period?
Fort Dix, New Jersey for basic, and then Fort Bliss, Texas. Ironically named. It's in El Paso, and it was not very blissful. That was the anti-aircraft gun training.
And thereafter, you emerged with a training in a non-functional
Oh,
weapon?
yeah, I had, there was, when one wasn't doing that actual work with the anti-aircraft gun, time hung heavy on one's hands. So I did a lot of reading in the post library, trying to decide what the hell I felt interested enough in doing to choose a career of one kind or another. So I had found that reading, kind of psychology, sociology, culture, history, things in the general area of social science, or even what we'd call cultural studies, I suppose, today, were the things that I was most interested in reading. So I decided I would go to graduate school, and in some academic thing. I had done, as I say, history, modern European history, in undergraduate school, and so I applied to graduate school in history, modern European history. And I chose Berkeley because I'd been out there on a rugby playing tour, and I rather liked California. It was the first time I'd ever been there. It was very different from Cambridge, Mass, and I felt I'd had enough of Harvard and Cambridge and so on. So I went to California, and this was the year before the free speech movement. This was it was 58, 59, yeah. And at that point, Berkeley was, and I guess all California universities were, it was a real culture shock. It was the first and maybe last time I really had such an intense culture shock type experience. It was like a glorified high school. Everybody walked around just robot-like, obeying the rules, except for a handful of, it was a rapidly growing handful of sort of rebellious types with whom I made friends. A lot of them went on to organize what became the free speech movement. At that time, it was called Slate. There was a slate of student candidates who were running against the administration and so on, and against, of course, it was both in support of things like the civil rights movement, black liberation movement, and also Vietnam War was starting up. Anyway, so that, I don't know, I was sort of peripherally involved in all that sort of thing. And at the same time, I was trying to figure out if history was really my thing.
You'd applied for graduate school in history.
And yes, and I was there. Therefore. Yes, I had been. And I was, you had to take an MA and then go on to a PhD if you made the MA. And I got involved in doing social and economic history, basically. David Landis, who's just acquired sort of fame in the subject.
The Unbound Prometheus?
That's right. And Henry Rosofsky, who later became Dean of Harvard, who was an expert in Japanese Far Eastern economic history. He and David Landis gave a good seminar in social economic history. And I took other courses of intellectual history and so on. Anyway, I realized that the kind of history I wanted to do was always, at least in terms of history as it then was taught in America, sort of on the fringe of kind of a more theoretical, a more culturally and socially, sociologically contextualized sort of historical interpretation, and not the rather positivist and kind of not all that overtly interpretive history that one was taught in most of the history classes that I had taken at Harvard and took at Berkeley. And I decided I liked intellectual work. I liked academic life, I thought. But I didn't really particularly like history. I thought it was kind of flat-footed and intellectually uninteresting. I think history's changed a great deal since then, but anyway, so by a process of elimination, I sort of asked myself, what am I really interested in this stuff, and what is the discipline that really teaches it? Sociology? Well, sociology had a lot of the kind of flat-footed, positivist kind of approach that I also didn't like much in history, and also it seemed it didn't get involved in questions of cultural interpretation and so on, or much about psychological interpretation. I sort of had an interest in, I don't know, cultural interpretation of psychology or psychological interpretation of culture. Thanks. And on the other hand, psychology, personality psychology, clinical psychology, and sort of psychoanalytic interpretations of historical and so on. Although it was fun to read them, it really lacked either much of a historical or a firm theoretical sociological basis. So by elimination, I thought, well, anthropology is sort of open to all those. It does all those things, or at least potentially does. It's where you can do cultural and social and even psychological kinds of interpretation. And historical, all at the same time.
Yes,
so,
it was a subject which you had a rather negative experience of back in Harvard.
I had. So I decided I should apply in anthropology and go on, see if I could do a degree in anthropology. And then the question was where. I really didn't like California, and I didn't like Berkeley. I didn't like the big rah-rah fraternity and big athletic sort of stuff. I played rugby for Berkeley, but that was another story. Basically, it was a kind of academic culture that I thought it reminded me a lot of American high school. I really didn't wanted to get the hell out. As I said, if it had only been the next year, it would have been fantastic. But it was the last year of California universities as a kind of infantilized high school kind of thing. So I having decided to leave Harvard and Cambridge and to get out to California and try something new, I ended up deciding to go back to Harvard not directly in anthropology, but in something that was then called social relations, which was a combination of sociology, anthropology, a promising discipline called social psychology, which has since been liquidated, and other psychology, clinical psychology. So I went back to Harvard and I took my PhD in social relations with a concentration in social anthropology.
Had Berkeley offered you a studentship for a certain number of years, and therefore did you have to say that?
No, I had won an independent scholarship for it was good for 4 years, but I could take it wherever I wanted.
So you took it back to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
Social relations, is this a department or a field or a faculty which still exists?
It was no. It finally self-destructed. It was really primarily formed by Talcott Parsons, the sociologist, who was a man with imperial intellectual ambitions. This was going to synthesize psychology, all those things, social psychology, sociology, anthropology, all together in his general theory of action, which was a kind of deactivated Weberian position. I don't want to get off into that, but anyway.
But was this what you were finally looking for in graduate school, where Berkeley had not delivered? Was it stimulating? Was it interesting? Did it attract and appeal?
Yeah, a lot of it did. I learned to sort of. It turned me against psychology, psychological anthropology, for the most part. Which I thought of as it was practiced in America, and that America was the country where psychological anthropology had been really developed, and I thought it was...
What did it mean in that time? What was psychological anthropology standing for in the late 50s, early 60s in the States?
Well, it involved the application of psychoanalytic concepts and to some extent learning theory concepts to cultural patterns and to some extent some social patterns like kinship patterns and so on, but in ways that really abstracted from a sociological context of analysis. And I had, doing French social and economic history in Berkeley, I'd read a lot of Durkheim and the Année sociologique and the French sociological tradition, going up from, actually from the 17th, 18th century, going up through Saint-Simon and Comte and Fustel de Coulanges, and then up to, as I say, Durkheim and his students and the Année sociologique. So I arrived there at Harvard, having sort of read a lot of that stuff, and I saw that the American psychological anthropologists, who perhaps unfairly epitomized at Harvard by John Whiting and his wife, who had what seemed to me a really aggressively simple-minded approach to doing a kind of crude psychological statistics kind of analysis, and they openly sort of, well, spurned the kind of social theoretic traditions, well, not only of the Année sociologique, but of British social anthropology, which was, at the time, still quite strongly based and rooted in the Durkheim and Année sociologique tradition. And the same went for Weber and whatever came from Germany. And all the things that I felt. Basically, I had become converted to someone who believed in social theory in that sort of more European sense. Although there were social theoretic ancestors also in American social thought, but none of them seemed to play into the psychological anthropological tradition as I was exposed to it anyway. And so I, in my first year of graduate school in social relations, where I worked some with Talcott Parsons, taking seminars where Parsons' theoretical scheme was, I thought, a real dead hand, but he provided a shelter for people to read all the great social theoreticians, with one exception, which you can probably guess. You couldn't quote Marx in a Talcott Parsons seminar, but Weber, the Année, also British economists like Alfred Marshall, and people who had a kind of a social dimension of economic analysis.
What was he like to be in a seminar with? Do you have any reminiscences and thoughts about Talcott Parsons? For me,
yes.
It's just a name. It's a book. It's a famous person.
Yes, he was. He paid attention. He listened. He responded. He was a pretty good seminar leader. He was, of course, enormously egocentric and authoritarian in a sense, but he was also rather gentle and encouraging for anyone who showed, some kind of an interest in social ideas and so on, theoretical ideas.
Did you dare raise Marx? Did you bring him in occasionally into seminars on the risk of the wrath?
I didn't know anything about Marx at that time. Really knew virtually nothing. I mean, I'd read a few things as an undergraduate, you know, Manifesto and so on, but I didn't know anything about Marxian theory. And my politics weren't really, in any sense, Marxist at that point. They were still kind of, you know, well, maybe social democratic, I guess, but not Marxist social democratic. That all came rather later, Marx. But anyway, Parsons also, I think, give him his due. He was a fantastic lecturer. He had an extraordinarily clear mind, and he could walk into a classroom without any notes and produce a 56-minute lecture, exactly 56 minutes if it was an hour lecture course, where everything would have come out as if it were a set of Roman numerals with sub A, sub B, and he, with that together with the readings, it was a good exposure of a certain kind. The only problem was then it ended up at these fourfold boxes and things like that, which was just...
But what held the department together of social relations? Was there a methodological or a theoretical underpinning which meant that all students or PhD students at that time would be schooled in a similar way of thinking about the world and would construct PhDs from that perspective?
Parsons and his system were the most, the closest that anybody came to providing a kind of common foundation. But really, I mean, the anthropologists, anthropology students, there weren't that many, you know, there were maybe half a dozen a year who were admitted in social anthropology. And they took some courses in the anthropology department, which continued as a department of biological and archaeology and, quote, cultural anthropology to one side of the social anthropology department. And in fact, Kluckhohn, as the leader of the anthropology department, had a falling out with Parsons. He had been part of the social relations department, but had left it and had gone off to champion the sort of more desocialized cultural anthropological point of view. So the anthropologists sort of bridged two worlds in that sense. The psychologists weren't interested in Parsons by and large. The social psychologists who were doing things like small group analysis and Kurt Levine kind of field theory, things like that, got over a little bit into some of Parsons as he sort of used some of their ideas. That was but anyway, mostly it was a rather eclectic mix that really didn't have any comprehensive theoretical framework. And indeed, after Parsons retired, it really fell apart.
So you're describing really a department spearheaded and dominated by one intellectual heavyweight who brings it together. And with his departure, then the end of that.
Yeah, although I think some of the other members, particularly perhaps psychologists, would have objected to being left out of the list of heavyweights. I think they thought that they were pretty heavyweight guys.
Your PhD, what was it on, and how did it take shape?
Oh, it was on the Kayapo. Like I say, at the end of my first year, I had taken another disasters course with Kluckhohn, as it was required of first-year people in the anthropology program. Course in anthropological theory. Well, that succeeded in convincing me that I really was not, if that was anthropology, I wasn't going to be an anthropologist. But at the same time, I had learned more and more about British thinkers, anthropologists, well, going from Radcliffe Brown to Fortis and Evans Pritchard, little bit of Leech at that point. And I could see that there was a great deal of continuity between them and the French. Also, our introductory seminar, for the sociologists, no, the social anthropologists in the social relations department, was run by Evan Vogt, and his way of running it was to just assign the total works of some anthropologists to each student, who then had to read the whole oeuvre of, say, Margaret Mead or Julian Stewart or Evans Pritchard or something, and report to the class. Well, there was this guy I'd never heard of, a French guy called Lévi-Strauss, who at that point was largely untranslated, and it turned out I was the only member of the class who read French. So I was assigned to read Lévi-Strauss and report to the class. And, well, none of my colleagues, that is the other students my year, had heard of Lévi-Strauss either, or certainly if they heard of him, had never read him. And I don't think Professor Vogt had heard all that much about Lévi-Strauss either. But anyway, he tossed me Lévi-Strauss. And so the result was that I really started out my first year of anthropology reading as much as I could manage of Lévi-Strauss. I mean, Les structures élémentaires de la parenté, I'd never had any kinship before. I had very little idea of the Morngine system. Well, anyway, there was that, and Tris tropique, and Anthropologie structurale. Anyway, I found it both interesting and kind of repellent in some ways, and I thought that there was something really wrong with structuralism, its predilection for static paradigms from which all kind of syntagmatic ordering had been abstracted. I mean, you couldn't, to say that you're analyzing myths where what you do is strip out the entire narrative structure of the story and just reduce it to so many jigsaw puzzle pieces of logical oppositions between signs and so on. It seemed to me to be an obviously crazy way to proceed. So I wasn't captivated by it, but on the other hand, I thought it was fascinating to look at that level, at that detail, at the content of the signification, so to speak, of bits of stories, and look for patterns in them. Not just of stories, of course, cosmologies, classifications, kinship systems too, in different terms. And so I thought the big challenge of structuralism was to kind of amalgamate that kind of approach with a kind of social contextual approach. And then in the next year, David Mabry Lewis came to Harvard from Oxford. He was a student basically of Needham, and he, because of Needham, he also was very strongly grounded in Année sociologique and Durkheim, and he was kind of committed to a kind of social critique of Lévi-Strauss as well. And so I found myself doing reading courses with him, talking about the Année sociologique people and Lévi-Strauss, and taking his kinship course and so on. And he of course had worked with the Apuin-Chavante, who are Ajay-speaking people in central Amazonia, central Brazil. And at one point he suggested to me that I should think of doing something like that. I had decided that probably what I would end up doing as an anthropologist was to go to France and study maybe some kind of industrial suburb of banlieue of Paris, and maybe compare what happened to people in those big apartment blocks that were being built to the way they lived with each other in the villages, provincial villages from which they'd come. Because what the French were then doing, factories like Renault, for example, were taking workers from a single area or village and putting them all in the same apartment block and so on. So there was a kind of interesting study, a comparative study. Anyway, I thought that maybe that's what I'd do.
Were you, as a graduate student at Harvard in social relations with a focus on anthropology, constantly encouraged to try and find a field location, and were you on the lookout for one?
Yeah, yeah. So this was, I started my first year, as I say, I had this idea about France, and Lawrence Wiley, who was an anthropologist who wrote a famous book called Village in the Vaucluse, and some other books about France from a kind of a cultural anthropological community study point of view. So I had started working with him, but then, for reasons I've said, I got over into working with Mabry Lewis, and he suggested that I think of going to work in the Amazon on this large and still very little contacted Jay-speaking group called the Kayapo. And I thought, why not, what the hell? It sounded like something really challenging and great and interesting, and so I decided to do it.
What year are we in now? I know you went to the Kayapo the
Second
first
year.
time, I think in '62.
That's right.
So we're now a year or so before that.
That's right.
Mabry Lewis, what was he like as a teacher, as a mentor, as a professor?
He was very young. He was, I should actually add, his wife was also important, Pia Mabry Lewis, a Danish woman who, well, they were great people. They were very good hosts, and they had students around, unlike many Harvard professors who never let a student pass the threshold. Some did. Some were not like that, and David was well, in age, he was very close to us. I mean, he was only a few years older, and he was very accessible, and I found there was a good deal in common intellectually and so on. So, well...
Did he become your PhD supervisor?
Yeah, he did. Well, if under those circumstances, if you go and work with a Jay-speaking Amazonian tribe, chances were very heavy that David Mabry Lewis was going to be your supervisor, as indeed he became. So that's the way I sort of found myself going down to Brazil and working with Kayapo. I have to say, I thought at the time it would be great and kind of intellectually kind of a unique opportunity to work with a virtually intact culture, as I thought the Kayapo would turn out to be, where you could get to know everybody, all the individuals of the community, and maybe even all the Kayapo individuals. I didn't really know nobody knew how many there were, and know the entire culture. I thought one could learn the language, learn everything, and so you could really do a kind of a totalizing global analysis. The other kind of influence that was very important for me was doing linguistics, structural linguistics, field linguistics.
Who was it taught by?
A series of people. It was in the first great years of Chomsky and the Chomskyan critique. But before that, of course, there had been American descriptivism, Sapir and Bloomfield and people like that. And there were lots of ideas about the microanalysis of semiotic forms. And I found that stuff fascinating. In a way, it was a kind of continuation of some aspects of the interests I developed in as an undergraduate in analysis of texts.
Did you take then linguistics classes, which then fed into...
I did. And I was interested in some of the philosophical issues. I went down to MIT and audited some couple of classes of Hilary Putnam, who was interested in the philosophy of language, and Roman Jakobson was still lecturing at MIT and came to Harvard every once in a while to lecture.
How was he as a lecturer?
Wonderful. He was like a Stanislavski actor, yeah, he was a theatrical figure, just a marvelous and magnetic person.
What kinds of things could you do to prepare for field work, and what tips did maybe Lewis or others give you about entering Brazil, living there, working with people who are poorly documented?
Well, learn Portuguese. So I took a summer school course in Portuguese. And learn the theoretical issues about analyzing these communities, which, you see, at the time it was thought that all these J communities, being matri, uxori local, were matrilineal, or, as Mabry Lewis had found, patrilineal, but anyway, they're based on descent, unilineal descent, and exogamous relations between descent groups, either moieties, exogamous moieties in most cases, or in the case of the Shabante that Mabry Lewis had worked with, it seemed to be they had kind of a tripartite division. But anyway, the emphasis was on sort of, I don't know, a kind of an analysis of the corporate divisions, and underneath that level, families and domestic groups and so on, with an emphasis, and this was turned out to be extremely important. Mabry Lewis had really introduced this into studies of Brazilian societies, of the developmental cycle of these groups, how they went through a series of changes in their composition over phases of between formation, dispersion, and so on, and how the dynamics of this process tied into the kind of political organization of factionalism and so on. And that was, I took that with me to the Kayapo. But David was antipathetic to the idea of field methods. And I mean, his attitude was rather, this is not something that he said, but it's something that someone else said, which sort of evinced his attitude when this person, I forget who the hell it was, some anthropologist, was asked what his methodology was. He replied, my methodology is to eat a bowl of Wheaties and then run 5 miles in the morning. The idea was, if you're any good, you get to the field, you speak a contact language, you have to learn the local language, and you do a genealogical census, and then you sort of go from there. You figure out what's going on. But how you do that? Well, if you can't figure that out, you don't belong in anthropology. So to hell with field methods courses. I mean, that was his sort of approach. I hope I'm not being unfair, but anyway, that was sort of my attitude too. I mean, you could having read a lot of anthropology books, but also history books and whatever, you have an idea of what putting together a study of a certain, I don't know, problem or set of facts is. And all of the nonsense about statistical testing and other kinds of questionnaire stuff, the kind of stuff that was floating around in social relations because of the psychologists and sociologists, seemed to me to be just irrelevant.
So you didn't leave the field then with a theoretical or intellectual agenda which you were testing or setting out to prove?
Well, really, there was, I suppose, a sort of an agenda. Basically, I had to write a field grant application. Yeah, and I made that as a kind of study of moiety systems and what the basis of moiety organization was. Can't remember the details. It turned out to be totally irrelevant because the Kayapo moiety system, I found, had collapsed. There were no moieties anymore. Not only that, but there was no descent and no exogamy. I mean, the Kayapo had a kind of a bilateral kindred system with age sets and ceremonial associations and very elaborate ceremonial system, but no, quote, dual organization or moiety structure, no exogamy, no descent, none of the things that up till then had been thought to be the central aspects of Central Brazilian social organization. And so it was start over, which was very much the sort of situation which I guess, in a way, my training, or rather my anti-training, had prepared me for. It then became, well, quite difficult to actually talk about this with David Meyrelus. I thought that, look, the Northern J systems, there are many of them, and they all turned out, almost all, to have no descent and not to be exogamous. And so they weren't, many of them had moieties, however. And I thought, look, you can't explain these systems as essential in Levi-Straussian sort of terms. That is, they're not systems of exchange, of exogamy. They're not tied to marriage at all the way that exogamous moiety systems were supposed to be. And so you need to think of a completely different theoretical frame of reference for the interpretation. What is the relation between these collective systems, these institutional forms, and the substratum of families and domestic groups and that sort of thing? And I came to think that, in fact, you could understand, in each case, these collective systems were symbolic extrapolations of the key moves that people made in these lower-level domestic group cycles and so on. They regulated the reproduction of these domestic groups and families, and for that matter, of social persons, because social persons were largely constituted by the kinds of positions, statuses they occupied in families and domestic groups, and that the collective groups that were founded on that were, in a sense, kind of generalized projections of these patterns that were continually reproduced in the domestic group and family cycle and person cycle. I got very interested in Kayapo bodily decoration when I realized that it's very complicated, the body painting and the kind of ornaments, the earplugs, penis sheaths, lip plugs, and so on. They're all bestowed in certain rites of passage at certain stages in the life cycle, which are the same key moments of transition in the family cycle and domestic group cycle. And that meant that male and female persons at different stages of their cycles became little microcosms of the congeries of relations in the domestic and family cycles, and also, of course, in a kind of microscopic sense of the whole macroscopic structure of the community. It became impossible to explain these ideas to David, at least at that time, and he thought
this is all on returning from field work, or did you communicate with him by letter from Brazil?
Every once in a while I'd send a field report or something, but also then after I got back and was writing my thesis, I think it kept coming out that he thought that I was trying to do a reductionist interpretation, that the whole collective structure institutional structure was a projection of it was determined by the domestic group and family thing. I kept saying that, no, actually I thought I was trying to describe a feedback system in which there was both a top-down and a bottom-up kind of influence. Well, I was starting to think of such systems in terms of something called a dialectic. By then I'd been starting to read Marx. And also I was starting to think of social production as something that had to be thought of, especially in societies like this, where there was no commodity production, no market, etc., as the production of social persons and households and families, and that these institutional structures were ways of regulating social production in ways that, among other things, involved relations of exploitation, gender exploitation, exploitation of juniors by seniors, and all that. Well, this fell on ears which, well, were not prepared to agree anyway, and I think that this was true for most of my colleagues in the Central Brazil Project, the Harvard Central Brazil Project, including Brazilian anthropologists.
Well, was there a project? There was an organization
Yes.
which was holding.
Yes, David had the idea of organizing a controlled comparison of the different Jesus. It's a natural context for that, rather like the Western Pueblos that Fred Egan had written in his famous book. So that's the way I had gotten my grant before. I was the first, anyway, to go down, but then David got this grant for something called the Harvard Central Brazil Project, which also, which had a very good idea of that a number of Brazilian anthropology students would go up to Harvard and be part of the department and also get money from this grant to do research on other Central Brazilian societies, people like Roberto da Mata, Julio Melati, Roque Laraya, people who've become very important in Brazilian anthropology. At the same time, of course, we would go down and take courses in the graduate program of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, which was the leading, at that point, graduate social anthropology program in Brazil. And so this all happened, and this was all David's creation. It was a great idea, a great project. But somehow, intellectually, it never really came off. I mean, we published a book together called Dialectical Societies, but you can read in the introduction how my interpretations were described as the sort of odd person out that I was some kind of Marxist reductionist, whereas the others were doing their Needham-esque sociology kind of, I don't know how quite to describe, but anyway, yeah, if you're interested, you can read that introduction.
That was published post-field work, I take it.
Oh, absolutely.
Writing up.
Absolutely, yeah. It was published, actually. It came out after a number of years, 1979, I think it was.
Two thoughts on what you've been saying. Firstly, on relations with David Mabry Lewis. Professional disagreements aside, could you nevertheless still continue to work with him? And did he understand that your analysis might be different, but that it was functional and cohesive within his own understanding and own paradigm? Or were there tensions already then?
Well, yeah, there were tensions because I couldn't understand why it was so impossible to explain and get David to understand at least what I was trying to do, that I was trying to talk about a feedback system between levels rather than simply a reduction of everything, all the upper levels, sort of to the most basic level. I thought you could agree or disagree with that, but you can at least understand it's not such an unknown or a difficult idea. I mean, Gregory Bateson had been writing about this for 40 years by the time I was...
So why his resistance? What did you attribute it to?
I don't know. I don't know what made it so hard, and I won't speculate. but it was hard, and I sort of eventually gave up. Well, I got my PhD, and I mean, he didn't block that, although his comment on my thesis was, actually it was a slight paraphrase of a comment that Evans Pritchard had made on someone else's thesis, as I later found out, but it was something like, Professor Turner has made an interesting contribution to Central Brazilian ethnography. It is difficult to say, however, in exactly what this contribution consists. Punkt. Yeah? Anyway, I got this degree, and I got a job at Cornell. This was at a time when jobs were not given or gotten by placing ads in something like the American Anthropology newsletter and having people apply and get recommendations. It was like, at least in the elite departments, if you needed a job, or you needed to hire some particular kind of person, you just called another elite department and asked the chair of the department if they had anybody coming along in that subject, and if so, well, they were just told to send him along, and we'll, ask him to give a paper or something, and then if it works out, fine, we'll do it. So, in my case, it was Alan Holmberg, who was the author of a book, a very widely read book called The Nomads of the Long Bow, and also was running a kind of applied anthropology project in Vicos, Peru, who had discovered that he had a fatal case of, I guess, leukemia or lymphoma or something, which had been caused by his having been left by a careless X-ray technician on an X-ray table for a couple of hours or something instead of for the requisite 10 seconds or something. And so he was chair of the department, but he wanted to replace himself in the department with someone who was doing Amazonian anthropology. So he called up Harvard. It was Professor Bowett who was chair. Asked if they had anybody, completing a PhD in Amazon anthropology. And Bowett said, "Yeah, well, we've got young Turner." So, well, send him along. So I showed up at the airport, and Alan Holmberg picked me up, and I don't know exactly at what point they decided to give me a job, but in the next couple of days, and so I found myself with an offer of a job. I had also managed to score a Fulbright to go to Paris and work in the Laboratoire Technologie Comparée with Lévi-Strauss. And so I had to choose between Paris and Ithaca. And oddly enough, I chose Ithaca. I thought, look, I've had enough of kind of being a graduate student and reading theory and so on. I'd love to live in Paris for a while and, work with Lévi-Strauss to the extent that's possible, and all the rest of the things that one could do in Paris. But I thought it was time for me to see, really, well, if I could actually stomach, I guess is the word, working in an American academic context. I mean, one of the things that Harvard PhD, which I never thought was worth the paper it was printed on, had left me with was a really deep disgust for the bad teaching and the lack of intellectual commitment and the theoretical banality and I thought it was bad, and I thought the human relations among the faculty and between the faculty and a lot of the students, or between the students and a lot of the faculty, were awful, and that it was a terrible way to live, and I didn't want to I thought that being outspoken, I didn't want to live any other way, would just, if in a place like Harvard, would very swiftly land me in trouble, and I would never have a prayer of staying and getting tenure. Influential in this judgment was what happened to another teacher of mine, Tom Beidelman, who's now at NYU, who took a principal position against giving a PhD to a protege of Talcott Parsons and George Homans, who were members of the Social Relations Department. And as a result of this, Parsons and Homans really, they considered this a kind of lèse-majesté, and it was inconceivable. This young assistant professor, who was a relatively flamboyant character, didn't conform to all the Harvard academic stereotypes, should actually resist them and veto or vote down the thesis of their protege. And certainly, when he capped this with statements like, anyone who could accept this thesis has to be either dishonest or incompetent. Well, Homans and Parsons had both already approved it. It sort of sealed his fate at Harvard. But I had thought, he was, for me, the teacher with the most, integrity and passion for his subject, and so on. And I thought I could see myself ending up, as he did, leaving the place where he was an assistant professor and working at another institution. Well, Tom has done, of course, very well in the end, but it was a kind of scene that I could see myself getting into.
I'd like to ask you a couple of things, backtracking somewhat, rewinding.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, about Levi-Strauss,
Mm-hmm.
the possibility of going to work with him in Paris, which you forego to come to Ithaca. Did you ever end up working with him or meeting him?
Oh, often. In the next, decade, I guess, after this, after coming to Cornell. I taught at Cornell 2 years, 67, 68, 66, 67, and 67, 68, and then went to the University of Chicago. But between 67 and 79 or 80, I guess, I was in Paris fairly frequently, and whenever I went, I would pay a call on Levi-Strauss, who had read things by me, especially my thesis, and would amaze me by asking questions about, on page 362, you say that the term for mother's brother is blah, blah, blah. And this was at a time, for example, when I had just dropped by without any prior appointment, so he could not possibly have swatted up in advance. And why would he have swatted up in advance? To impress me. Come on. So he actually was a rather special scholar. He's incredibly widely read, and he would love to talk about Brazilian ethnography and ideas about it. He liked speaking Portuguese. His Portuguese is excellent. So even though my French is okay, we almost always spoke in Portuguese, and it was very, very pleasant.
The second question I have is about partners. Did you leave to the field the first time in '62 with a girlfriend, a wife?
Yeah, I've somehow, the way the conversation has gone, I've sort of missed a number of crucial stochastic turnings in my life. This was, Joan Bamberger, and I got married, met in Harvard Graduate School. She was a student in the Department of Anthropology, had just come over from archaeology into cultural social anthropology, and we sort of got together and went down, we got married and went down to the field together. She also wrote a thesis about the Kayapo, Conceptions of the Natural World, and we stayed together for 7 years and then got divorced amicably and are still friends.
Was fieldwork therefore an easier experience, having a partner with you, a wife, who could mediate, at least you could speak to her in the evenings and talk about all the things that happened in the day, or how was the interaction in the field with your partner?
Oh, it was a great deal more comfortable and pleasant in a variety of ways than just being there alone. Kayapo, especially at the beginning, were not the easiest bunch of people to just kick back with. I mean, they were not only, in many cases, Gorotire, the community that I started working with, was a place which had a core group that had been part of the community when it made peace in 1938 with the Brazilians. But it consisted of about a half of its population was that core group, and the other half were much more recent immigrants from other communities, which in some cases had only been pacified in the Brazilian sense, that is, established peaceful relations with the Brazilians for 4 years. Communities like Kubenkraken, for example, and the Mekrano tea groups from the west of the Xingu. People like that had been, their relation with the Brazilians was very like the relation between Apaches and Mexicans in the days of Geronimo. I mean, it was a very active military raiding situation, and so they were not, and they were never defeated in any battle with Brazilian police or army forces. They were seduced by offers of presents in exchange for settling down. But they had lost none of their propensity for aggressive bluster as a way of getting their way. It was fairly hairy at times. And also the Brazilian agents of what was then called the Indian Protection Service were, in some cases, they were corrupt and sleazy bastards who had their own ways of trying to do you in. And so it was not a situation which, would have been particularly pleasant or easy as a single young man. I think it was, on both sides, it was a lot easier and a lot better, a lot more pleasant to be a couple. For both of us.
What was fieldwork like, though? You set off for your first piece of anthropological fieldwork. It's a very exciting thing, probably quite a nerve-wracking thing to do to a place where little is known. Maybe some guidance from maybe Lewis about how to get somewhere. But you arrived in Brazil. Where did you take it from there? How did you get
I because of David Neighborless's contact with Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, who was a Brazilian distinguished social anthropologist, who was running the program, the postdoctoral student program I said postgrad, it's postgraduate program, the Programa de Pós-Graduação em Antropologia Social, the postgraduate program in social anthropology at the Museu Nacional, which was set up as a kind of graduate department. The first step was to find a place to live in Rio and join the kind of ongoing seminar that Roberto Cardoso was running at the Museu Nacional, which was reading works of social anthropology, both Brazilian and foreign. It was like a seminar with Brazilian graduate students, yes, graduate students, and well, me, and Joan, and then later other members of the Harvard Project who did that seminar for a while. It was a context. I stayed in that context for about 3 months, where I got my Portuguese a great deal better, and also learned about how to get into the interior. At that point, it was well beyond the frontier of Brazilian settlement. There was no surface transportation, but the Brazilian Air Force mail service, it was called the National Postal System, the Correio Aéreo Nacional, the National Airmail System, which basically used World War II C-47 transport planes, bimotor transport planes, and sometimes Catalina flying boats, PBY flying boats, often with repairs from the war, and there would be these wartime designations and stuff where obviously it had been used in the U.S. Air Force or something. They flew into the interior at airstrips that were established at these Indian service posts, one of which was Gorutire. So the idea was you got your field kit together, went down to the office of the Correio Aéreo Nacional at the airport of Rio de Janeiro, and you flew in. It took about 3 days to get into because it was a milk run thing. We kept landing at various places going across Brazil until you got into the interior. And then you got there, and it was up to you to negotiate to get a house built or whatever.
Were you the first anthropologist who had worked in that area? Or had there been reconnaissance visits from the Brazilian administration beforehand to find out who was there, how many people?
Well, there had been an Indian service post established and a mission of the Unevangelized Fields Mission that had been established there since 1938. But there had been anthropologists with the Kayapo, not with the Gorutire, but with other groups, to the east, a large group that had become extinct, actually, by then. German anthropologists, Fritz Krause, Ehrenreich, Kissenberth, people like that, Snethlage, mostly out of Leipzig. And German ethnology was very active in central Brazil at the latter quarter of the 19th century and the beginning, first 2 decades or so of the 20th century. And then, of course, the greatest of all those figures, Kurt Unkel, who's adopted the Indian name of Nimwendaju, so Kurt Nimwendaju, became the greatest of all Brazilian ethnologists. He arrived, I believe, just after the First World War. And he worked with the Kayapo for a while. Didn't publish on him, but except for one little article, and then something that he wrote together with Robert Lowe, full of really bad misinformation, saying that they had matrilineal exogamous moieties or something totally untrue. But I found his untranslated German field notebooks in the archive of the Museo Nacional, and this is an advantage of coming into anthropology from doing European history, where I could read German, and it was very useful to have those field notebooks, and also to have read Krause and Kissenberth's and notes on the Kayapo. So I had that start, as well as Nimwendaju's great monographs on the Eastern Tibira and the Apinagé and so on, there are other Northern Jay societies which are very close to the Kayapo in many ways.
Was fieldwork, though, the anthropology that you've been looking for? Having had some rather unsatisfying lectures as an undergraduate and then graduate back at Berkeley, and then of course at Harvard, was fieldwork where it came alive? Was it exciting? Was it wonderful? Was it challenging in all the right ways?
Yeah, it was exciting and challenging. It wasn't always wonderful.
Did you get ill? Did you have...
Sometimes I got ill. But basically, I got ill coming out of the field into cities like Rio, Sao Paulo. I was pretty healthy in the field. It's a healthy life. It's a healthy environment. The food is great. Wonderful game, fish. A lot of protein, a lot of very varied garden produce and wild produce. It's a good life. Other things being equal. When we started out with the Kayapo, however, the Kayapo were in pretty desperate straits because they had accepted the Brazilian offers of peace and so on, but in exchange for promises of periodic infusions of presents, gifts, and so on. But of course, those became fewer and farther between the more peaceful they became, and there was a lot of tension over how essentially poor they had become. I mean, in their natural, that is, their pre-peaceful contact state, they weren't poor, and they didn't have the problems with epidemics and disease and so on that they've started to have as the result of the contacts that they were having with Brazilians. But now, that's not to say, however, as I came to realize, that they hadn't become dependent on Brazilian manufacturers and commodities long before they made peace. I mean, they had really they had developed a kind of raiding economy where every year they would go out and acquire new supplies of ammunition, colored cloth, firearms, steel tools, pans, metal pots, and there was only one way they could acquire those, basically by raiding Brazilian settlements, and mostly that meant killing the people who had owned them. So they were sort of, quote, Apaches in the American stereotype or Mexican stereotype of that kind of relation. So for them, making peace had been sort of, to turn Clausewitz on his head, a continuation of war by other means. It was a different way of getting goodies.
One of the things that I think you've become known for in American cultural anthropology and across the world in the discipline is for advocating for and standing up for the rights of the people with whom you work, professionally, personally, and this has led to various articles. How did that start? When you arrived there, did you, for the first time in '62, think, no, this is the place I could spend more time, this is the place where you developed close relationships quite quickly, or did that come with repeat visits?
It came with repeated visits, and I didn't start out to be an activist. With the Kayapo, I started out to be an objectifying anthropological analyst, ethnographer, theoretician. I was interested in problems of theoretical problems of interpretation of indigenous social structures and myths and rituals and the whole kit and caboodle. Wrote my thesis on social and political organization of the Kayapo, but included a lot of material on ritual, because ritual is a part of social and political organization, especially among the Kayapo. And I became progressively more involved in, well, first, taking the part of the Indians against the Indian service, because they were really being exploited by the Indian service to produce crops like Brazil nuts, and the Indian service was, its agents were selling off their production, in ways that, sort of extra legal ways. So they weren't returning any of the product any of the profits to the Indians. And I even denounced one set of encarregados, that is Indian service agents, to the head of the Indian service in Rio, only to find that a few months later, this very head of the Indian Service was fired for corruption involving, in part, being in cahoots with the very guys that I had denounced. So that when I went back, I faced a series of fairly exciting incidents with these guys, but they never really became physically threatening, just unpleasant. But there are several things that were going on. From 63, early 64, I got back from my first field work. But when I got back from my field work, especially at during my thesis time, I wrote the thesis rather rapidly, so I didn't ever have a chance to get much involved in the political activities that were steadily growing in those years against the Vietnam War, especially. But when I then came back in 1965, and I then took, as I said, my first job in fall '66. I got more and more involved in anti-war activity. There were still aspects of the black struggle going on. And one of the things that was happening there was that people who were activists were trying to teach themselves Marx and the whole Marxist tradition, because we hadn't learned that in American universities. And so I joined a series of reading groups, and I read and studied Marx in that context
At Cornell.
starting at Cornell, but then going on to Chicago. And it just went along with being a political activist at that time. But since I was at that point, I was an assistant professor. I was a young faculty member. I tried to build all the stuff I was doing in these reading groups into my teaching. I started teaching courses in Marx and Marxian theory, Marxist tradition in various ways, with emphasis on the kinds of things we were hitting in these reading groups, the context of activism. But at the same time, I felt like a kind of a double schizophrenic in a sense, intellectually. I mean, I was teaching Marx. We were reading theses on Feuerbach and Capital and all that. Then I was talking about the social production of households and domestic groups and moiety systems and so in central Brazil. And that was not somehow meeting up with the Marxian stuff. I mean, what do you do with societies that don't really have economies? There's no commodity production, no market, nothing like that. But of course, in Marx and Engels, early Marx and Engels anyway, you've got this rich tradition of human production, global social production, the production of the person, the production of needs, the production of social relations. All that counts as production. Well, the Kaipo were doing that. And in fact, I thought, in a sense, my whole interpretation of them was gravitating towards making social production in that large sense the basis of my whole interpretation of their, what you might call in Marxian terms, ideology and institutional structure and so on. That was schizophrenia number one. That is, I was trying to reconcile the Marxian tradition with the kinds of interpretations I had sort of been working out of the Kaipo. But the second schizophrenia was, of course, that along with Marxian understanding, a Marxian theoretical approach, goes a commitment to activism. And the question was, what kind of commitment to activism did my theoretical approach to Kayapo and other Amazonian society questions that I was working on involve? I mean, what is the basis of activism in a Marxian sense? If you lift the whole question out of the context of a class struggle, a class society, well, I had sort of come to see Kayapo society is built around relations of exploitation. As I mentioned, gender exploitation, exploitation of juniors by seniors, sons-in-law by parents-in-law, all those kinds of things. And that in a Marxian perspective, you should be able to understand exploitation as involving asymmetrical distributions of social value, which means you have to have some kind of theory of value for a society lacking an economy and lacking any category of abstract labor or any of the categories that were fundamental to Marxian theory of value, as taught and certainly understood by us amateur Marxian scholars in these reading groups. So I became more and more involved both in teaching and in political work, political activism, with these questions. And one of the things that they led back to was the question of what kind of activism or commitment to political activity, what kind of political activity did my work with the Kayapo lead to. So there's a political level of the question, but there was also, of course, a human level, because all this time, 68 was the great year of the great scandals of so-called genocide of Amazonian Indians. It was a very overblown use of the term. Genocide is a policy of extermination of a whole ethnic genus of people. The Brazilian government was not committing genocide in the sense that the Nazis committed genocide, but it was not doing its utmost to help the Indians survive either. I mean, it was presiding over a system where, with malign neglect, it was allowing the course of development, a kind of a brutal, ecologically and humanly destructive development, to roll over Indian societies that really had no defense against the process. It was bad what was happening, no question about it. And I thought anybody who would forget Marxian theory, I mean, if you've been there and you know what's happening, you have to speak out against that. But also, I thought it was important for anybody with a theoretical approach to the question and supposedly tools to understand things in a theoretical way, including relations of exploitation and that sort of thing. It was important to make theoretical sense out of it and to build that theoretical sense into what you are doing or going to do about it. And so I got interested, and so I became involved in organizing various kinds of political projects, NGO, non-governmental organization activities, working with Brazilian non-governmental organizations, such as what was then called the Ecumenical Center for Documentation and Interpretation and Information, the Centro Ecumenico de Documentação e Informação, and the Center for Indigenous Work, both based in São Paulo. I worked a lot with those groups and tried to articulate the Kayapo and Kayapo activists and activities with them, and vice versa. And I also tried to address the questions of human rights and indigenous rights, territorial rights, so on, cultural rights, group rights, all those issues at a theoretical level and an institutional level within the American Anthropological Association. Not because, well, just because that was the association to which I belonged, and I am, after all, an American and teaching in American academic context, so that seemed the place to start. And I became involved in the effort to establish a Committee for Human Rights in the American Anthropological Association. It was quite a struggle. There was a lot of opposition because people thought, number one, well, there's a lot of feeling that anthropologists are objective scientific scholars and then value-laden research and commitments to activism have no place in that. Secondly, there was a lot of feeling that taking positions on behalf of indigenous peoples in a country like, say, Brazil, would lead in short order to anthropologists being excluded from working in Brazil, and that anthropologists just were cutting off their nose to spite their face, so to speak, by adopting these positions. And so, well, became involved in arguments against that position and became a founding member of the Committee for Human Rights. Started out being the Commission, well, the Task Force on Human Rights, then the Commission on Human Rights, then finally the Committee for Human Rights. And in the course of that, one of the charges that the association laid down for its Commission and then Committee for Human Rights was to formulate an anthropological position, a general anthropological position about human rights. I mean, after all, if anthropology is the science, if you will, of human being, human existence, then it should have something to say about human rights. I mean, what is it about being human that confers rights? Or if you think you know, you can say something about what it means to be human, you should be able to say something about why having rights is part of that, or flows from that. Various publications followed from that. Some in partnership with comrades on the Human Rights Committee, people like Carol Nagengast of the University of New Mexico. We co-authored, we co-edited a issue of the Journal of Anthropological Research, wrote a joint introduction. That's now being published as a book. And, well, there have been other co-publications, but I think this is a series of issues I think are quite theoretically fundamental for the discipline. I mean, it's not that applied anthropology or issues like that, which always were the sort of stepchild of the discipline, and they were partly the stepchild of the discipline because the approach was basically that if you were doing applied stuff, you were teaching people to get out of their whatever their culture had been and become good little marginally utilitarian consumers and producers for a capitalistic enterprise. I thought it was very important to try to help establish a different sort of approach to applied work and activist work. First of all, to bridge the gap between applied and activist anthropology, because applied anthropologists, many of them, resisted classifying themselves as being activists because that seemed political and they were just being economic or something like that. Anyway, but beyond that, the idea that, well, there was theory on the one hand and then there was activism or applied work on the other, I thought was fundamentally wrong. That in fact applied anthropology and, well, what it might be anyway, and human rights and issues of that sort were posed challenges that of a kind that put an entire discipline on its mettle. That the discipline, if it really had anything to say at all, should be able to confront the implicit, and I hope increasingly explicit, theoretical issues in that sort of line. And I think that's happened to a great degree, but I also think that those are struggles that are going to have to just keep being, to the extent that they're ever won, they're going to have to keep being won, because I think there are very powerful pressures in the other direction, always.
Two questions about this, which have occurred to me while you've been talking about it. The first is the involvement and complicity with Brazilian authorities. You've mentioned the fact that you went to Indian Affairs and said two of your characters weren't doing as well as they should have been. On the one
that
hand,
was in 1963, yeah.
On the one hand, you're getting a research visa probably, or permission to work in the area from the administration. On the other hand, you're representing the perspectives and often the needs of the indigenous people with whom you work. Have there been tensions throughout your career about this, or have Brazilian colleagues also understood your activist perspective, or how does one negotiate those conflicting loyalties as well? To the academy, to Brazil, to the indigenous communities?
A lot of questions there. Yeah, there have been a lot of tensions, but there are tensions at every level. There are tensions working with the indigenous community, where some indigenous leaders, in my view, have been busily involved in selling out their own indigenous kin and compatriots, and one struggles at that level sometimes with them. And on the other hand, there are many very good people who work for the Brazilian Indian Service, or at the present, it's called now the National Foundation for the Indian, FUNAI. And I myself have worked for FUNAI, most recently last year, when I did a whole investigation of an area which is a traditional Kayapo area, which has remained undemarcated, and is as it were, the keystone in the arch of Kayapo territories along the east bank of the Xingu River. I prepared for FUNAI and acting as a consultant for FUNAI, a report on the basis for making a claim for demarcation of this area, the ethno-historical basis, the basis in use, the basis in the politics of the area, and the threat to various sorts of agribusinesses encroaching, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, that was a contribution to what I hoped would be a FUNAI effort to actually get that area demarcated. And, compile a report, a fairly extensive effort, and it was filed. Briefly, it seemed like that was all that was going to happen. I wrote an extra memo when there was an outbreak of shooting, that nobody was hurt, but that was by sheer luck, and that tensions were reaching a really explosive point, and that they had a choice. They either had to do this demarcation and somehow decisively intervene to get these guys who are doing these invading illegal ranches and so on, to get them out of there, or else they were going to have a situation of low-intensity warfare in the Xingu that was going to be extremely hard to control. And perhaps partly as a result of that memo and the previous report, FUNAI has now undertaken to form a brief, to produce a legal brief for the demarcation of the area. And I feel very good about the comradeship I have with some of the people who work in the Fundiario department of Funai and the Educación department of Funai, who work with the Kayapo too, and are the real spark plugs for pushing this project. So, although there has been a lot of corruption and terrible inefficiency and so on, especially at the higher levels of Funai as a bureaucracy, seems sometimes just hopeless. At other times and at other levels, there are very good people doing effective things to help the Indians. So you can't generalize. I mean, it's not the good Indians versus the bad white men or government people. And there are wonderful, dedicated Brazilians who have formed NGOs, which have done extremely valuable, just invaluable work to support indigenous causes, and I've tried to work with them. So it just if you try to be sensitive to who the players in this struggle are, and also even some of the private sector people, businessmen and so on, ranchers. There can be good guys on that side who try to get along in a decent, fair-minded way, as well as murderous bastards in that sector. So you just have to really keep an open mind and find out what's actually happening, and then try to, where you can make a contribution, make it.
The return of ethnographic and anthropological data to the communities with whom one works. One of the things that I've understood, particularly in the Himalayas and in South and Central Asia, about activist anthropology is that there's a commitment to sharing the findings, the data, the analysis with the communities with whom one works. If you talk in Marxian terms of exploitation on the basis of gender, on the basis of age perhaps, access to resources, reproduction, those could be words, concepts that when translated into Kayapo or into Portuguese make people uncomfortable. How does one score, how do you square the circle of being both an activist at the same time talking about things which the indigenous communities themselves may have trouble with reconciling?
Well, you don't
It may not be a
have
very
to.
clear question.
Yes, if the question is, how do you deal with, on the one hand, as an anthropologist, producing certain sorts of interpretations which are different or alien to, or at least not part of the indigenous worldview or whatever, and on the other hand, being an activist and trying to protect, like, their right to, or help them to reproduce their own cultures or protect their right to be themselves and so on. I guess I don't really think that there's any problem at all. I think that
Have you never been asked then by a Kayapo friend or colleague, hey, I thought you were the guy who was fighting for us. How come you're using the words exploitation in your articles about us? If not, then
no,
great.
there aren't any Kayapo who have got to that level of theoretical
Well, that was my next question.
sophistication. I mean, the Kayapo, for example, have started to have democratic associations in their communities. They've realized that Brazilians and NGOs think that communities, to be proper communities, should have associations with a slate of officers, and there should be voting for these officers, and that periodically there should be a new election, and so on. And several communities have produced such associations with Kayapo names, and then there's an election, and so on. In one of the first instances of this, I said, well, who's going to vote in this election? He says, well, we'll call all the men together. They'll be in the men's house, and everybody can vote. And I said, well, what about the women? He said, well, what about them? Well, why are you going to have them vote too? Did women vote? Never thought about that. He says, well, why don't you let them vote? I mean, why shouldn't they also vote? They're members of the community. They have different kinds of, like, economic involvements with the surrounding society, can produce things. They say, and the guy said, oh yeah, okay, so the women can vote too. Things are still at a level where decisions of that sort aren't treated as involving fundamental aspects of Kayapo society and so on. They're still playing a game that's really, it's an alien game. And in many respects, when you can say, listen, well, for example, another time, I was trying to do a bilingual education project where I was teaching fundamental concepts of reading, writing, so on. I tried to use sample words and sentences which were actually political ideas, like we have a right to our land, this is our culture, blah, blah. Culture is the way we produce ourselves, so on.
Rather than this is a pen, my name is
That's right.
Terence.
That's right. And so we went along on that basis, but I insisted that girls should be included as well as boys in this. And so they were. And that was a new idea for them, because the previous classes that there had been, at least the earlier ones, missionary taught classes, and the missionaries there were trying to teach them to read their own language so that they could then read a translation of the Bible into their own language by the missionaries. So I taught this class with girls. There is now a series of well, there are two parallel programs for training Kayapo professores, teachers. One taught by Funai, and another taught by a different sort of NGO-based project. And they teach both girls and boys. And there are a lot of literate now Kayapo girls and boys, literate in both Kayapo and Portuguese. And, I think, at least agitating with the Kayapo for both boys and girls education has been part of that that situation. I think it would have happened if I had never been there, but I think the fact that I was there and had gone through those things with them probably helped in some instances to promote that. I could go on with examples like that, but I think it's at that level that one can start to make a difference with things like that, rather than, one can preach, about one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, or something, and that you realize how profoundly that is at variance with a culture where the idea of a person is of a cumulative process of becoming perfect, becoming whole, becoming wise and deserving of political influence, so that the idea that everyone should be equal is transparently absurd. Yeah, you're saying that the oldest man or woman who has lived for whatever, 70 years, or 50, 60, 70 years, at the height of their powers, activity, they've got experience, they've proved themselves by various things they've done, should be treated for purposes of voting as the same as a newly initiated bachelor youth or a girl who's, 17 or 18 years old? Come on, you can't be serious. That's the Kayapo attitude to things like that. And there's such a gulf between many of the assumptions that we think liberal, progressive NGOs tend to think are the goal of their work, to make the Kayapo more civilized and so on, are profoundly, just profoundly absurd from the Kayapo point of view. You have to be able to understand that and deal with it somehow.
You mentioned, Terry, a move to Chicago at a certain point from Cornell, and now here we are back in Ithaca, Cornell University, from which you recently retired. How long was your Chicago sojourn? What took you there, and what were the general experiences and tenets of that experience in Chicago?
Well, how to say this? I didn't like Ithaca much when my first time here. It was in, as I say, 66 to 68. I had just gotten divorced. I was a young single man, and Ithaca was not at all the cosmopolitan, fascinating, culturally diverse, exciting place that it has since become. It seemed to me to be an extremely provincial, conservative, dull place with terrible weather and very little social action. I mean, if one believes that, as a professor, as I do, one should not get involved in, what shall we say, intimate social relations with students, that leaves very few options, or left very few options in a place like Ithaca. And I found that I was spending my entire salary on weekends in New York and Boston and places where life seemed more possible in ways that were important to me at that time. Well, now that I'm an old fart with a family, it seems very different. I mean, this was, first of all, Ithaca has changed a great deal. I've changed a great deal. What happened was, of course, I gave a speech, talk at one of the Anthro meetings. People from Chicago were in the audience. They invited me to Chicago to give another talk. They decided to offer me a job, and I actually went like a shot. I mean, I thought, I want to be in a city. I want to be in a great university with a theoretically more lively department that's really involved in theoretical issues. See, the department here had seemed to me to be much more, at that time, much more into a kind of area studies emphasis, where the thing was to be a kind of, in effect, an Orientalist scholar, whatever your field was, Oriental or not, and there was no real interest in generalizing theoretical issues. It's not fair to certain people who were here, but the preponderant sort of intellectual life of the department was along those lines. And Chicago was the premier department in the country, really, from a social anthropological point of view, and it was the department in the country that was most identified with taking seriously the tradition of social theory and things like the année sociologique and British social anthropology, with which I'd been most involved as a student, researcher. So I went there and stayed there for 30 years, I guess. I finally left. I went in fall '68 and left in spring 90. What was it? 99. So it's yeah, 31.
31 years of professional career.
And meanwhile, I'd gotten married to Jane Fages, who was professor at Cornell. She got a job at Cornell. At the time she was on the job market, I said, look, anywhere in the world you want to go, I'll follow you. I'll arrange a commute or maybe try to get a job there, whatever. Anywhere but Ithaca. I just had fairly dismal memories of Ithaca.
She was a student here, or a professor here, or
she had been she had gotten her degree from Stanford, and then she was an associate of the department in Chicago, along with me. She had done her field work in New Britain, Papua New Guinea, and well, all that's well known. And she landed a job, of course, at Cornell in Ithaca, and then we had to decide who was going to commute. People here.
What year did she get?
It was August of '89, I guess, that she got the job. In other words, fall '89, and we had 2 young children, young daughters, quite young, 5 and 7, something like that. And so we decided that since she was starting out, didn't have tenure, and was going to have to teach new courses and so on, and then there were the young children who we thought it was more important for them to live with their mother than with me. We decided that I should be the one to commute, and she should, live with the children at her place of work. And that's the way we set it up. Of course, I thought at this time that I was making the sacrifice. I was going to do commuting. I don't like commuting. It's not a good way to live. But of course, at the same time, it made her a single mother for 4 days of every week, or we found we couldn't afford to have commute every weekend from Chicago, so it was every other weekend. But still, well, it was probably more of a strain on Jane than it was certainly than on me. But nevertheless, she published her book and got tenure and so on. And
was Jane with you in Chicago until '89,
yeah,
when she got the job at Cornell?
Yeah.
So how did you do it? You flew U.S. Air from Chicago through Philadelphia or Pittsburgh to Ithaca once or twice every couple of weeks?
You got it.
Amazing. And you maintained an apartment in Chicago, or a house?
Well, we had lived in a collective house in Chicago with political friends. It had been founded in the palmy days of collectives and radical politics. 1968, the guy who became the Secretary of, first I guess, was it Treasury, but then of State, George Shultz, Nixon's Secretary of State, had lived in a townhouse 5 minutes walk from the university campus, south side of Chicago. And when he went to Washington, it was offered for sale, and a graduate student in the anthropology department who came from a quite wealthy family had enough capital to team up with a bunch of other graduate students, and they made an offer on the house, and they bought the house. They painted the door red. It became known, it was no longer George Shultz's residence, it was the Red Cats Collective. And we moved in after, I don't know, 3 years or so. And that became the place where we lived, and we had both our children in Chicago, and we were living there. Well, then, of course, Jane got the job, and she and the kids moved here. But I continued then to live in a room in that collective when I was in Chicago. So it was a little bit more than a pied-à-terre. I mean, it was eating with the folks there, and kind of a home away from home, can I say that? Or it was what had been home for both of us. And it still is when I go back. I still have, of course, students in Chicago who are finishing their degrees, and when I go back to sit on their defenses and so on, I stay at the collective.
It must be difficult to sum up 30 years of professional life in a university like Chicago, but for those who are not at Chicago, the university, at least the anthropology department, carries a certain mystique and allure. It is definitely one of the world's most dynamic and well-known departments for a number of reasons. Does it differ very much from the department here at Cornell, and what are the changes that you've seen in your 30 years of professional association with the Chicago department?
Well, Cornell has changed an enormous amount. I mean, the Cornell department is a lot more like what the Chicago department was. I think the Chicago department has also changed a great deal, because almost all the people who were committed to the kind of social anthropology, great tradition of social theory, have left.
Such as?
Well, I mean, the people who first, Radcliffe Brown taught there, and then Fred Egan was there. It was a Radcliffe Brownian, and then Tom Fowlers, the Bavarian, the Clifford Gerrits, David Schneider, both of them students, ex-students of Talcott Parsons at Harvard, but people who had spent time in Schneider's case at the London School of Economics, and had been closely associated with some figures in British anthropology, and Nur Yalman, Stanley Tambaya, who are both from Cambridge, and Raymond Smith, also from Cambridge. I mean, a whole line of people like that. Now, all those people have either left the university for one reason or another, to take jobs elsewhere, or in a couple of cases died, or retired. And I'd include myself in that sort of line of people, number of people. And now there are, well, there are a number of new people who have been hired in sociocultural anthropology, and they're excellent people. They just don't have, I don't think there's not the same continuity of orientation. So it's not that, I'd say the continuity now is represented by, I'd say, John and Jean Komaroff, from that sort of line of people. Anyhow, here at Cornell, instead of the old, well, when I was here, it was, as I say, really the old system was that the basis of the program was simply aerial preparation and becoming a specialist in one area or the other. And there was no common curriculum. You formed a committee, and the committee could be all sinologists or all whatever, your area. And you just did all your reading, your preparation, your general examinations, or A exams, they call them here. And then there was, you'd write your thesis with those people and so on. So there was the department had no commitment that there should be any common body of theoretical reading or history of anthropology preparation. Not that there weren't people who taught courses in theory or history of anthropology, but they weren't in any sense required or expected of graduate students in the program. So there were some who would take the courses, but others wouldn't. And so it had no kind of identity, collective identity, any commitment to a common vision of anthropology in any sense, except as a set of area expertises. That changed partly around the time that Jane came here. She was part of this, but was certainly not the only part. I mean, a number of the other people in the department had felt that it was time that the university should, that the department here should have a common core of coursework where people would be exposed to the ideas of anthropology and ideas of social theory, the relation between anthropology and say, well, economics, linguistics, so on. But also people should know the history of the field, what American anthropology, how it developed, what about British, French, German, etc. And so there were courses instituted to teach that, and students were let know that even though they weren't going to be forced to take these courses, that the department thought it would be a good idea if they did. And of course there have been some kind of defiant holdouts of people really actively trying to keep their students from taking these common courses, but many others who have taken them, and I think it has given the department a completely different feeling than it once had, and a feeling much more like the Chicago department.
A couple of final, albeit large, questions. The first is that about the Kayapo video project, which I understand was started in 1990. You'd worked with the BBC and Granada Television, making ethnographic films or anthropological documentaries, whatever one might want to call them. Could you explain a little about the history of the Kayapo video project, what it aimed to do, what it succeeded in doing, what the challenges were?
Well, as you've mentioned, I made some documentary films, first with the BBC, this series called Face Values, that was back in the 80s, and then 2 films with Granada, one in 87 and one in 89. And in all those cases, I had come to Kayapo communities with British film crews, and we made, we shot a lot of footage, many hours film, and made films for British television, although they, in several cases, have since been shown in many countries, though interestingly, never in Brazil. The Kayapo had, before the first time I went to the Kayapo, a couple of years before, 3 Brazilians who were students of kind of media and communication studies in Rio had the idea of going to the Kayapo with a video camera and shooting themselves doing the shooting, but then and this was a general documentation of whatever they could find that seemed significant, and then they taught a couple of the Kayapo to use the video camera, and in a couple of cases brought them out to Rio, where they gave them more training, in a couple of cases, well, in one case anyway, rather advanced training in video and film techniques. Not editing, but shooting. And they left a video camera with them. Now that video camera no longer worked when 3 years later I showed up with the BBC crew. But the Kayapo were already savvy enough about visual representation to know that they could do it, and that there were Kayapo who had learned to do it. Secondly, they had a much better idea than other, perhaps, first-time experiences with video in maybe New Guinea or something like that. A much better idea of the role of visual media, television and cinema, and photography and the press and so on, in the national culture. I mean, how important television news programs and movies and so on were. So that the idea of making films that then might be shown to themselves in this way, on monitors and so on, but also to Brazilians and the world, was an exciting idea for them. And so when I came with these, as I say, the British crews, well, one of the things we had to consider was what sort of presence to bring to the communities to sort of our reciprocity for them cooperating with us. And I made a point that one part of that reciprocity should be video cameras that one each trip, so that we could provide them with video cameras at the same time that we were filming them. And then, of course, the question was, what would they shoot? And this was an interesting question, from a variety of points of view. Also, how would they shoot it? And what community reaction, what community involvement would be? Would everybody want to be the cameraman? Or would they be indifferent to it? All those sorts of things. Those were the kinds of questions that I started out with. But when I considered that it was not just a question for them of doing interesting close-up or panoramic shots or whatever. Actually, they weren't interested in close-ups. They were interested in panoramic. But also how they were going to construct, if they had the chance, overall representations of events, like a ceremony. It turned out that, of course, the things that they most wanted to shoot were ceremonies. When I gently suggested that they should also film things like gardening, they looked up like eyes would roll up. Gardening? Why? They weren't interested in the quotidien, everyday life. They were interested in the spectacular, the extraordinary. They were interested in things that they considered to epitomize their values of beauty and finesse and performance, panache, and they really, they really developed, organized their skills around shooting things that embodied those values. But the next step, obviously, they did certain other things that I thought were interesting and showed a lot of sophistication and intercultural awareness. They realized that the Brazilians, one of the ways the Brazilians classified themselves in relation to them, the indigenous people, was that the Brazilians controlled the technology of representation. So that it was important for them to demonstrate to the Brazilians that they jolly well controlled the same technology of representation, and that while the Brazilians were pointing cameras at them, they were going to walk up to the Brazilian cameras and point the camera right back at the Brazilian camera, and the Brazilian or world documentary, BBC or whatever, cameramen shooting them. And they did this, and then they carried this over to things like filming the Brazilian Constitutional Convention that was writing the clauses, the new clauses of the new Constitution for indigenous rights. And so they show up and film the debate, including members of the opposition who were orating against the idea of indigenous rights and so on. And they would get right up close to those guys and just hold a camera on them as they said, well, indigenous people are incapable of blah, blah, blah.
How involved did you become in this process? I know you've written about it and you've lectured about it, but were you often there at some of these recording events?
Some, but not all. I certainly didn't have to be there. By the time, really, after very little time with them, we're teaching some things about video and camera technique and that sort of thing. I didn't have to be there. But one thing I realized that was a need that I really could fulfill, and a place where things would get even more interesting from my point of view, was that what they would do was produce these continuous shoots, and then they would have these cassettes of video, which they would then show to themselves, and they could hook it up to a monitor and VCR, something else that I had been able to provide. And then they would kick around the villages, getting dustier and more stretched and so on. And that would be that. Potentially, anyway, they would get lost and damaged and so on. So they needed an archive, a place where these things could safely be stored, and then copies could be made. But of course, the other thing they needed to be able to do, above all, was to be able to edit their footage, so that they could construct out of their raw rushes, the raw footage, deliberate representations of the essence of these events, whatever they were, as they saw them, either their own ceremonies or encounters with the Brazilians or whatever. So I started to, first of all, I started this video project. I got a grant from the Spencer Foundation to help train Kayapo to edit and produce videos, which could then be used for a kind of an oral history and education of the Kayapo, by the Kayapo, of other Kayapo. The Center for Indigenous Work, the Centro de Trabalho Indigenista of São Paulo, made available its editing studio. It has a project, or it had a project then, called Video in the Villages, run by Vincent Carelli. And Vincent collaborated with and supported this Kayapo project, and provided technicians at the Centro in São Paulo to work with Kayapo cameramen who came and learned to edit their own videos. Meanwhile, I had assumed the role of assistant editor. So what I had done was keep the shot record. And then I would sit with the Kayapo editors, acting like an assistant editor, namely, tracking their decisions for cutting and inserts and so on, all the things they would do with their own shots, and noting on the shot record which they used and what their reasons for making the decision if those questions arose. And I realized that this is a way, it's a way, a very material way in which you can study the process of the formation of representations. It's an objective correlative, as T.S. Eliot might put it, of that process, and it was profoundly interesting. I thought it's a field method. my one contribution to, I think, the literature on methodology or field methods, become an assistant film editor of an indigenous cameraman as he edits footage. And if you've done the shot record properly, you have a total inventory of what the raw material of the representation is, and then you can see how he plays over this raw material and shapes it into a finished construction. So that was, as it were, the anthropological side of the Kayapo video project. But the other side was, of course, that the Kayapo produced these marvelous films of their own ceremonies and encounters with the Brazilians, and they're still doing.
And were those films shown on Brazilian television? Or
Never. Not on Brazilian television. They've been shown in various other places. The Brazilians have not been into showing indigenous work, especially indigenous films about their own, about Brazilian officials' encounters with Kayapo. Yeah. Since some of those have been highly agonistic. But I'm not saying they haven't shown other indigenous footage. They've shown some of Vincent Corelli's films. But they've been shown in many festivals around the world, for example, and been shown in somewhat here. The thing that keeps them from being, or has kept them from being more widely shown, is of course that they are produced by Kayapo for other Kayapo, and they're in Kayapo. In 3 cases, I've made translations, either into English or in some in parts of one in Portuguese, but with subtitles and so on. There's English narration and English subtitles. But I have to do a lot more of that. And now that I've retired from teaching, I'm going to work a lot more on those films.
Okay. I have then 2 final questions. One about the retirement and the plans now that you've reduced your teaching load. I won't say completely finished, because I'm sure you have grad students who will continue to supervise.
Oh yeah, but I'm not giving courses.
I'm not giving lectures on a daily basis. But the main question is about something that happened in September 2000. And I quote here from an article. In an extraordinary open letter to the American Anthropological Association last week, Terence Turner of Cornell University and Leslie Sponsel of the University of Hawaii alerted the association and hundreds of participants on several email lists to the upcoming publication of Darkness in El Dorado, How Scientists and Journalists Devastated the Amazon. This has been a moment in contemporary anthropology which has captivated an audience beyond the anthropological. It went to the New York Times, The Guardian in London. Many students of social science know about this. Could you explain a little bit now, for the record, what happened, what you did, what the responses and reactions were, and in a way, why it was so important?
Well, that passage that you've just read is a great example of something that Glenda Jackson, in one of her roles, where she is, the wife of some British colonial official in Africa, says to a journalist about the journalist's misrepresentations of what I guess her husband had been up to or something. She has a little wind-up doll, and she winds it up and puts it on the table in front of the journalist and says, "This is my journalism doll. Wind it up and it gets it wrong." That wasn't an open letter that we wrote. It was never intended to be generally circulated. It was certainly not addressed to any general readership. It was a warning, an advice, let's say, advising the president and 1 or 2 other high, I don't know, what do you call them, officials, like the head of the Ethics Committee and the head of the Community for Human Rights of the association, that this book that we had been sent as press readers was about to be published, and it was dynamite, and it was really going to raise extremely urgent questions of ethics, of professional ethics, that the association was going to be held accountable for, because this was, after all, it involved the work of Napoleon Chagnon, who was the best-selling ever author of anthropology books, and the one that's The Fierce People and its various other editions, has been the basis of many, basis. It's been assigned in many introductory anthropological courses all over the country. And so that the profession has a certain involvement with Chagnon's work, and also more distant remove. I mean, there is the whole basis of of human genetics, which had been the basis of the anthropological, of the expeditions to the Yanomami, which Chagnon had been part of, but of course James Neal was the leader of those expeditions. And what they had done and how they had represented what they'd done were issues that the book addressed in great detail. And the details were pretty horrific. And it was easy to see that when this book was actually published, it was going to be read by journalists and cause a scandal, a sensation, and as indeed it did. And it was reviewed widely, often very favorably, and it got various kinds of honorable mentions for the National Book Award and all that. It was going to be a big book, and we thought that the leadership of the association should be apprised of this, what was in it, and what the kinds of things, the issues that it raised, so that they should prepare to perhaps investigate it, prepare statements, how to deal with the kind of scandal that this was going to cause.
Well, my first question then is, what were the allegations in the book? And secondly, if you're simply saying to a professional organisation which holds together the discipline which you're in, hey, you should know about this book that's coming out, it's rather important, and in fact you should be preparing some kind of press release or some information to deal with this, what was the storm about?
Well, first let me say that what happened when we sent this letter to the president of the association and one or two other people in positions of authority in the association was that one of them, on her or his own hook, hit the button on the computer and just started broadcast it out to the world. That person has never identified her or himself. No doubt because he or she realizes that, first of all, it was a breach of trust. It was a personal letter. Anyhow, there are a series of issues in the initial phase of this controversy. One was what Patrick Tierney, the author of the book, had actually said about the conduct of the expedition to the Yanomami in 1968 on the Orinoco, where they became involved in an epidemic of measles that broke out, and they at the same time were interested in drawing blood samples and other biological samples, and they also had a vaccine that they were using to inoculate the Yanomami. They have maintained that this was a purely humanitarian gesture. Others, including Tierney, have suggested that it was an experimental measure. That is, the vaccine was almost certainly selected because it was particularly liable to arouse very strong, severe reactions, indistinguishable from wild measles. And therefore, it was a way of testing the immune systems of these Yanomami who were a, quote, virgin soil population. They never had contact with the disease. It was known that Neil was interested in such issues. And there was no real evidence, hard evidence, in Neil's own protocols for this inoculation campaign. No protocol, it's extraordinary, but no protocol has ever been found prepared by Neil. But it was obvious that Neil and his medical assistant, Dr. Willard Centerwall, were aware of the reactive properties of this vaccine before they went down, because Centerwall wrote a kind of a mini protocol, which he and Neil, well, he was the person who actually wrote it and sent it to some missionaries to whom they sent some of this vaccine. What did happen was that a great many Yanomami, nobody knows how many, died of the measles, and Turin suggested that these deaths may, at least in part, have been caused by the vaccine. In fact, maybe the whole epidemic might have been caused by the vaccine. Many others have dismissed that, either said that vaccine can't cause actual cases of the disease or fatal cases of the disease. That, by the way, is simply not true, and vaccines do, from time to time, either because they're bad lots of vaccine or because of reactions, cause deaths or very severe illness. But also, the idea was that whether or not there was going to be any deaths in these vaccines, Neil was interested in the degree to which the Yanomami would turn out to be, on the basis of their just innate genetic makeup, able to resist this vaccine, or resist the effects of, in effect, of contact with measles. I guess this is not really the context to go more deeply into this. What happened about that and about many of the other charges in the book, some of which we mentioned, but not nearly all of which we mentioned in our memo to the association, about Chagnon and his effects on the Yanomami, some of his policies, the effects of some of his representations of them, and so on. These, we thought, and Tierney had also charged, raised various kinds of ethical questions. Were they accurate representations? Were they distorted, deliberately distorted in some cases, to bear out socio-biological ideas about Yanomami society, among which were that the Yanomami were actually a kind of an earlier stage of human evolution, much closer to primate societies, somewhere in between apes and humans, with alpha males who killed more enemies, reproducing themselves more, monopolizing more women, and therefore are contributing disproportionately to the gene pool. And was this a kind of a eugenic argument? Well, it was a eugenic argument. Neil explicitly made it as a eugenic argument in a famous article called On Being Headmen, and also in his autobiography. But supporters of sociobiology, including Wilson and others, leapt to the defense of Neil and Chagnon, denying absolutely, that there was nothing to this idea that Neil had such ideas, eugenic ideas, or that there was any experimental or scientific research purpose to these vaccinations, that was only a humanitarian measure, and so on. When I also repeated my own personal experience with James Neal, who at one point had proposed to work with a Kayapo rather than the Yanomami, and he ended up with one of his Brazilian assistants did, in fact, work with a Kayapo with cooperation from me. I provided the genealogies that they used to test degrees of genetic distance and so on in the Kayapo. Where am I? This idea that Neil had eugenic interests and was interested in the effects of the relation of resistance to disease to genetics and so on, and was using the vaccination campaign to test this in some way, which of course is not incompatible with the idea that was also a humanitarian gesture. And it was a point I continually made in the ensuing debate. It's not enough to say that it was a humanitarian gesture. Of course it was a humanitarian gesture. And Neil said that too. But that does in no way says that it wasn't also for scientific purposes.
Sure, a research exercise.
Yeah. At the same time, that point was never taken. Nobody has ever, on that side, the other side, and it was a side that came out with, great numbers of people thunderously denying absolutely that this epidemic thing and the injections and everything had any relation to research purposes. Even when I disclosed, having been alerted to this by Barbara Johnston, who was researching Neil's earlier work in the Pacific Islands, and that Neil had been part of a project in which vaccinations for things like pertussis, whooping cough, and measles, and so on, were used to quote, challenge immune systems so that the levels of reactions could be tested by the reactions to the vaccinations rather than to the diseases. He'd already been part of this and done this, but the only response to that was that by the main person who became Neil's main defender on the American Anthropological Association board, this is Trudy Turner, was that, my investigation did not include this memo, so I'm not going to address it. It was a kind of spin and stonewalling. Anyway, as I guess the point I'm getting up to is that a new echelon of issues arose in the course of what became a big controversy with lots of vitriolic emails and so on, much of it personal attacks on Sponsel and myself, which was that the association itself and the profession and those who were conducting this debate, many of them not anthropologists but sociobiologists or evolutionary psychologists, as they now call themselves, that their conduct of this debate was about as ethical and as devoted to scientific truth and critical exchange as Karl Rove's descriptions of, or the people who were working with him, descriptions of John Kerry's conduct and combat in Vietnam. And the association, which then proceeded to appoint a task force, which consisted of people who were about in some cases as neutral and in other cases as pro-Chagnon as could be found, Chagnon and pro-Neil, as it turned out, and produced, in several cases, obviously tendentious and biased accounts. The association acted primarily in a way calculated to cover up and just deflect the material rather than going into it. Although after the preliminary version of the report was released at an anthropology meeting and aroused a storm of controversy and protest, the Society of Latin American Anthropologists called unanimously in its business meeting for the withdrawal of this report, and there was great criticism in the business meeting itself of the association of it. That seemed to give some courage to the report, to some of the people on the commission, and in fact the report as it finally came out of the commission makes several very important points, and I think that's one of the lasting legacies of the controversy. But legacy number one, the main charges that Tierney raised were never actually, have not been refuted. They haven't, in some cases, the things about the vaccine, how much medical damage it actually caused, or the way it was administered, how much that damage that caused, has never really been resolved. But many other criticisms of Chagnon, for example, the damage he's done by both his statements and silences about the Yanomami, and the ways in which some of his actions actually damaged the Yanomami. For example, the whole business in the Siapa Valley that he attempted to carry out with, in conjunction with a right-wing Venezuelan politician called Brewer Carillas. These things were certainly attested and denounced by the task force, called evidences of breach of professional ethics. Some of Tierney's charges were indeed borne out by the commission. Secondly, the thing that was originally said that by the officers of the association, the presidents of the association, that the association could not investigate. It could only study and advise, but not investigate, certainly not individuals, and that this task force was not an investigation. Well, it turned out that it had to be an investigation, and the issues of Chagnon's conduct especially, and also Neil's, could not be investigated or studied apart from the individuals who had committed them. And so the ad hoc committee of an official body of the association actually ended up investigating and finding critical fault with the actions of individual anthropologists, something that was denied at the beginning. And this is a historic accomplishment. Another historic accomplishment is the Code of Ethics of the association was said to be not a document which could be used to evaluate the conduct of individuals, but only an educative, advisory sort of set of general principles. Well, in fact, it turned out that those principles, to the extent they meant anything, actually had to be applied. Their applicability to the actions of individuals had to be considered, and in certain cases it was found that the individuals had violated